Hi, I'm Staci Toji, and I serve on Go for Broke National Education Center's Board of Directors. August 10th marks the 32nd anniversary of the passing of the Civil Liberties Act, the legislation that provided an official presidential apology and monetary redress for surviving Japanese Americans who were affected by Executive Order 9066. We're happy to present to you today Dr. Mitch Maki, President of Go for Broke National Education Center, and his presentation on the redress movement. I still remember the day when my grandmother told me about the check she received 40 years after being released from Gila River concentration camp. And yet, I still don't fully understand all that went into the redress movement and this unprecedented legislation. So please enjoy this presentation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mitch Maki, President of Go for Broke National Education Center. We are a nonprofit organization which tells the story of the Japanese American soldiers of World War II, of their courage, their valor, and their sacrifice, as they upheld America's promise. The promise that in this nation, no one is to be judged by the color of their skin, the nation of their origin, or the God whom they choose to worship. Let me tell you a story of a small, disenfranchised community that became the victim on one of the most egregious violations of our Constitution, and then found the courage and the voice to demand an apology and acknowledgement from the United States government. December 7th, 1941, the imperial nation of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and it thrusts the United States into World War II. Japanese Americans immediately began to wonder, what would happen to us? Would we be treated like the American citizens we were, 2/3 of whom had been born here in the United States, the other third having lived here for 30, 40, and 50 years? Or would we be treated like the enemy because we shared a common ancestry? We received our answer 2 months later, on February 19th, 1942, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which created the underpinnings by which nearly 120,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens by birth, would be forcibly excluded from the West Coast and made to spend the next 3 to 5 years of their lives living behind barbed wire. We lost our homes. We lost our jobs. We lost our communities. But most of all, what was lost was a sense of place at the American table of citizenship. While living in these camps, Japanese Americans were forced to live in communal surroundings in desolate areas surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers. Worst of all, they were deprived of their constitutional rights. And then a curious thing happened about a year into the camp experience. The U.S. Army, realizing that the war effort was going poorly, decided that they needed more men to go and fight in Europe. They came up with the idea of creating a segregated Japanese American unit. Imagine the angst and the anxiety as these young men, boys really, 18, 19 years of age, were asked to fight for their nation, the United States of America, put themselves in harm's way, and possibly die for liberty and justice halfway across the world, while their own families were being imprisoned behind barbed wire. The issue tore the community apart, as families struggled over whether they would allow their sons to go and fight, or whether they encouraged their sons to resist. At first, the decision was a voluntary one, and then it became a decision as to whether to cooperate or resist the mandatory draft orders. Despite the paradoxical nature of the choice, thousands of young Japanese Americans from the territory of Hawaii, as well as out of these camps, said, "Send me." They would go on to become the most decorated unit of their size in American military history. In Europe, they were known as the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. These young soldiers were awarded 8 presidential citations, 21 Medals of Honor, and nearly 9,500 Purple Hearts. The medal you receive when you're either wounded or killed. In the Pacific Theater, Japanese Americans also served as interrogators, intelligence officers, and linguistic experts, and were credited with helping to end the war in the Pacific 2 years earlier than otherwise would have happened. Why? Why did these young men choose to go? Why did they choose to put themselves in harm's way, knowing that their own families were deprived of these same liberties? The best answer comes from a young sergeant named Kazuo Masuda. His answer was the answer that many of these young Japanese American soldiers would have given. When asked why he was doing this, his response was, "Because this is the only way that I know that my family can have a chance in America." Right or wrong, agree with him or not, Sergeant Masuda and the thousands of other young Japanese American soldiers understood that in 1943, 1944, and 1945, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood. 1945 comes, and with it, the end of the war, and the camps begin to close. Japanese Americans are given $25 and a one-way train ticket to go and reestablish their lives. On the top of the list was, let's get a job, let's find a place to live, let's put food on the table, let's send our kids back to school, let's rebuild our community. But there was another feeling, a feeling of shame, a feeling that somehow we had done something to bring this terrible tragedy upon us. The best analogy that I can give you is that of a sexual assault victim or an incest survivor who had something terrible happen to them through no fault of their own, but they blamed themselves. If only I had said this, if only I had done that, if only, if only, if only. Japanese Americans felt that if they had been more American, this would never have happened to us. Japanese Americans felt that they needed to be 110% American so that this tragedy would never happen to us again. The 1950s come, and with it, the beginning of change in America. 1952, we have the McCarran-Walters Act, which allows Japanese immigrants to naturalize for the very first time. 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education, which says that separate but equal is no longer the law of the land. The Civil Rights Movement begins in the 1950s, and in 1959, something occurs which sets the foundation by which someday the Japanese American community might be acknowledged by the federal government. What happens in 1959 is that Hawaii becomes a state, and with statehood comes representation. In fact, the very first U.S. representative from the now new state of Hawaii was a young man named Daniel K. Inouye. Daniel K. Inouye was a member of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and he lost his right arm in battle fighting for his nation. What better symbol of loyalty to send to Congress than somebody like Representative Inouye? The 1960s come along, and the 60s is a time of great change. The civil rights movement is in full bloom. The women's movement has captured the imagination of young people across the United States. The anti-war movement is teaching young people how to say, "Hell no, I won't go." And dissent becomes viewed as an American value. Ethnic studies movement is taking place in universities, and young people begin to look at their own history. For young Asian Americans, Japanese Americans in particular, they look back and said, what happened? Why did my parents go to these camps? Why didn't they resist? We would have resisted. and they begin to look at their parents and grandparents through the lens of cowardice and accommodation. But still, the Japanese American community was a long ways away from wanting to demand redress and reparations for what had happened during World War II. As an example, in 1963, there was a professor named Roger Daniels who taught a history class at UCLA. One of his first assignments was for his students to write an autobiography. Dr. Daniels had two young Japanese American students in his class. Both of them began their autobiographies by saying, "I was born in 1943 in Los Angeles, blah, 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 blah." Dr. Daniels read this and immediately knew there was a problem. He called them into his office and he said, "There's a problem with your autobiographies." Immediately, both of them said, "We didn't cheat, Dr. Daniels. I mean, how do you cheat on an autobiography?" Dr. Daniels said, "That's not what I'm talking about. Take your autobiographies home, show them to your folks, come back and see me." Sure enough, the next day, one of the young students came back to see Dr. Daniels. And he said, "You're right, Dr. Daniels. I shared my autobiography with my parents. I was born in 1943, but not in Los Angeles. I was born in Manzanar, a concentration camp." The pain, the shame, the wanting to forget was so powerful for some that they didn't even tell their own children the truth about the incarceration. The 1970s come into play, and with it, more representation for Japanese Americans in the U.S. Congress. By now, Representative Inoue is now Senator Dan Inoue. In 1974, Norman Mineta, the mayor of San Jose, is elected to the House of Representatives. Norm was a 10-year-old boy when he and his family were sent off to Heart Mountain concentration camp in Wyoming. In 1976, Spark Matsunaga becomes senator from the state of Hawaii. Senator Matsunaga was also a member of the 100th Battalion and a decorated war veteran. And in 1978, Robert Matsui was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Sacramento, California. Robert Matsui was a 6-month-old baby when he and his family were sent off to Tule Lake concentration camp. So, by the end of the 70s, we now had 2 decorated war veterans in the Senate and 2 former inmates of American concentration camps in the House of Representatives. But the community was still split as to how it felt about pursuing redress. Basically, there were 3 trains of thought. The first group said, "Let it go. It happened a long time ago, and we are doing much better. Don't make me tell those stories. Don't make me feel that pain. Don't make me go through those feelings again." It was primarily the elderly who felt this way. The second group said, "No. What happened to us was wrong, and we are deserving of an apology. Just give us a good, clean apology. Don't give us money." And there was a very pragmatic part to this perspective. The United States had never granted an apology nor monetary reparations to any group, so let's not overreach. But there was also a very principled reason. Don't insult me. Don't take away my constitutional rights, throw a few dollars my way, and say everything is okay. Don't put a price tag on my civil liberties. Just give me a good, clean apology. But the third group said, "Wait a second. Yes, what happened to us was wrong, and we are deserving of an apology. But there were real losses. People lost their homes, their jobs, their businesses. There were real losses, and there needs to be money attached to this bill. Give us an apology and give us money so that we know that this apology is authentic." This debate tore the community apart in the 70s, until finally in 1978, the Japanese American Citizens League the largest Japanese-American civil rights organization, passed its most strongly worded resolution. We demand a presidential apology. And along with that apology, we want monetary reparations in the form of individual payments and community payments. Over the next 10 years, the Japanese-American community engaged in a battle to make the story of the Japanese-American incarceration one that American legislators understood. It started with a commission hearing, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians in the early 80s. And then the battle migrated to the Congress, to the halls of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Finally, on September 17, 1987, the bill hits the floor of the House of Representatives. This day was chosen specifically as it was the 200th anniversary of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. And on that day, the impossible dream of obtaining an apology and monetary redress payments from the nation passes the House of Representatives. 243 representatives, 180 of them were Democrats, 63 of them were Republicans. It was truly a bipartisan effort. 7 months later, the bill hits the floor of the U.S. Senate, and we knew it would pass because Senator Matsunaga had personally lobbied every one of the other 99 U.S. senators. And by the time it hit the floor of the Senate, there were 71 co-sponsors. So now we needed only one more supporter, one more signature, and that would be the President of the United States. For those of you who remember, in 1988, that president was none other than Ronald Reagan, a very conservative president whose own administration had been fighting against this bill, both in the Congress as well as in the courts. Many of us thought that there was no way on God's green earth that Ronald Reagan would sign this bill. For those of you who remember Ronald Reagan, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. He had the ability to tell stories that would touch people's hearts and move them in a certain direction. Well, the opposite was true of Ronald Reagan. If you could tell him a story that would touch his heart, you could have a great advocate on your hands. So now the question was, what story could we tell Ronald Reagan that would help him understand on a personal level the significance of this bill? Well, remember I told you about Sergeant Kazuo Masuda, the young Japanese-American soldier who said that he was fighting because it was the only way that he knew that his family could have a chance in America. 2 weeks after saying that, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle, fighting for his nation, the United States of America. After the war, his family moves back to Santa Ana, California, only to be met with racial taunts, hate speech, and threats of bodily harm. The Army, realizing that this is a PR fiasco, that the family of one of its own heroes can't move back home, sends out a contingent of Army officers to have a medal ceremony for the Masuda family. That night, at the convention dinner, there was a young white American captain who addressed the audience. His name was Ronald Reagan. Captain Reagan addressed the audience by saying, "The blood that is soaked into the sands is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only nation not founded on race, but on an ideal. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, as one member of the American family to another, for what your son Kazuo did, thanks." That story was relayed to President Reagan in the 80s, and his response was, "I remember that family, and I remember what those soldiers did for America." On August 10th, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, providing a presidential apology, $20,000 in individual monetary reparations, and a $50 million trust fund for all those affected by Executive Order 9066. It was a very proud moment, not just for Japanese Americans, but for all Americans who cherish the Constitution and the values of our nation. Now, as I leave you here today, lest any of us feel that justice has been permanently secured, let me leave you with the words of the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Before his death, Justice Scalia stated that what happened to the Japanese Americans was wrong, but that you are kidding yourself if you think it will never happen again. In times of war, the laws fall silent. In times of war, the laws fall silent. Very chilling words for all of us who cherish the Constitution and the liberties which it presents to us. So as we end here today, I hope you will join me in committing ourselves to never again allowing in our nation our laws to fall silent. Thank you for spending this time with me.
Wow, what a wonderful presentation. And I'm lucky enough to be sitting here with Dr. Mitch Maki, one of the preeminent scholars on the history of redress. So Mitch, thank you so much for putting that video together.
It was my pleasure.
For me, someone who wasn't alive when the redress movement was happening, it was really eye-opening to see all that went into the movement. And for those of us who weren't around, I do have a couple of questions if you don't mind me asking. And in the video, you mentioned the individuals who wanted redress to happen. They fell into one of three distinct camps of thought. But it seemed like the third camp, which wanted the apology as well as money for what they lost during the war, they're the ones who won out. So what was the response after this $20,000 check was granted to detainees from the first two philosophies?
It was such a tremendous victory for our community that was the foremost thought of most people, regardless of how you felt beforehand, that, my goodness, our nation recognized what happened to our community, recognized that egregious violation, and said, I'm sorry. And really, it wasn't necessarily the money, it was the apology that just filled most Japanese Americans, if not all Japanese Americans who were affected by Executive Order 9066, with a sense of recognition, a sense of atonement, and a sense of validation that what had happened was wrong. And the truth is, $20,000 didn't change people's lives. It was a symbolic amount, that was meant to acknowledge what happened, right? And you hear stories of, some families donated their money, some families put it away for a college education for their grandchildren or whatnot. Only a small handful of people returned the money or refused the money. I mean, a very small number. But I think the one story that I'm reminded of is that in Los Angeles, a friend of mine, Ron Wakabayashi, who was the executive director of the JACL at the time, was at the local bank the days after the checks started to roll out, and he saw long lines of mostly Issei at that time depositing their checks, And he said he was filled with this sense of gratification, that here the people who had suffered the most, who had lost the most, were now at least able to cash their checks. And he saw this one elderly woman cash her check, and as she was leaving, he went up to her and he said, oh, congratulations, and what are you going to do with your money, as he struck up the conversation with her. And she looked at him and gave him this big toothless smile and said, I'm buying teeth. And it was just a great example of everyone had their ideas of how they were going to celebrate this moment.
In fact, if I may tell a story of my own, my grandmother was interned at Gila River, and when she got out, she settled in Monterey, and years later, she had heard rumors that the Japanese Americans were going to be receiving redress. And so my grandfather urged her to go down to the Social Security office and just inquire about it. So she went down and she met with one of the employees who was a Hakujin man. She said about my age, about 30 years old. And she said, excuse me, sir, I heard that the Japanese Americans were going to be receiving about 20,000. And he said, ma'am, why would the government give you so much money? And she said, well, because of the camps. And he said, what camps? And she said, well, you didn't know that they put us in camps during the war? And he had no idea. So for her, I mean, there was no malice. He really didn't know. He was just naive in that sense. So do you find that there was that sort of response to Japanese American internment? Do you find that there are other individuals out there who have never heard of internment or redress?
That was true in 1988, and it is true to this day when I lecture on this. People will come up to me, young people, and said, I had no idea. I had no idea that Japanese Americans were incarcerated. I had no idea that Japanese American soldiers fought for our nation and died in such large numbers and sacrificed with such courage and patriotism. And then again, they had no idea that our nation, in a moment of true strength, looked at what they had done and said, we apologize for what had happened.
And with the Issei and Nisei who were interned at the time, I know that you mentioned that they left camp with this innate feeling of not being American enough. And with people like my mom, for example, her first name is Barbara, her middle name is Louise. And I think that was because, when my grandma left camp, she wanted to assimilate, as much as possible after the war. But then the Civil Liberties Act was passed, and suddenly there was this acknowledgement that the Japanese Americans were in fact wrongfully incarcerated. So do you think because of the redress movement, there was kind of a resurgence of a pride for being Japanese American? And do you think that's the reason why the Yonsei have middle names again like Kimiko or Tsugio or Takeshi?
I think that plays a big part of it. It really was validation for the community that we had done nothing wrong. We didn't bring this upon ourselves. This was a violation of the Constitution. And it also gave us a chance to look back at what our young men did as soldiers during World War II. The Nisei soldiers who fought in Europe, the Nisei soldiers who fought and served in the Pacific Theater, and how they contributed to the war effort. And it also gave us an opportunity to look at the young men who resisted military participation, the resistors during World War II, that they were well ahead of their time in understanding the power of dissent.
So you mentioned that the Sanseis really started to question the older generation and what was happening at the time. Do any specific examples come to mind?
In the late 60s, there were two activists, Warren Furutani, who many of us know and respect today, and Victor Shibata. And they, along with others, decided that they were going to create the first Manzanar pilgrimage, the first journey back to where the camps had happened, right? So Warren tells the story about how he and Victor jump in the car, they start driving up to 395, they're gonna go to Manzanar, and they get there, they get out of the car, they start scoping out the place. This white pickup truck comes driving up to them, and in Warren's words, this redneck guy with the gun rack and the cowboy hat starts looking at them and says, "What you boys doing?" The first thing you don't ever want to do is call Warren a boy, right? Warren Furutani, man, he opens his mouth and he's like a slot machines and silver dollars start coming out of his mouth. And he says, we are here to commemorate what happened to our people during World War II and to make sure that we don't forget and that the nation doesn't forget. And the guy starts laughing at Warren. Now, after you've called Warren Furutani a boy, the second thing you don't want to do is start laughing in his face. And Warren says, I was about to jump down his throat. And the guy says, well, if you boys are here for Manzanar, you're on the wrong side of the road. It's over there. In the late 60s, we didn't even know where the camps were, let alone the history of the camps, so that there was so much still to learn. There was still so much more to still arm ourselves with in terms of an understanding of what really happened.
Right. And I think for the younger generations, we don't know what we don't know, which is why it's so important to have presentations such as yours and even books like the ones that you've written. So you wrote Achieving the Impossible Dream, How Japanese Americans Obtained Redress. So can you tell me a little bit about the book?
Well, first of all, I didn't write it by myself. I had two wonderful co-authors, the late Harry Kitano, who many people in the Asian American studies field know and revere. I mean, Harry was a giant in terms of Asian American studies. And at the time, a woman who was a doctoral student, Megan Berthold, who is now a professor in social work, and the three of us went on a journey together to write this book. This was in June of 1994, and I asked Harry, how long will it take us to write this book? And he says, we'll be done by December. And I thought, oh my gosh, 6 months to write a book? Well, Harry was correct. We were done in December of 1999, 5 years later. And this truly was a labor of love that the three of us participated in. We traveled the country. We interviewed legislators, attorneys, activists. And I was filled with two feelings as I met all these people. The first feeling was a feeling of awe, a feeling of these individuals, who many of them were just average citizens in terms of their training and background, made this incredible journey, made this incredible piece of legislation possible. Simply awestruck by that. And the second feeling I had was envy. I was so envious. I wish I had been a part of that, but I was a little bit young at that time, but envious of what these folks had accomplished.
Well, I look forward to reading the book. And you had mentioned Dr. Daniels, who again came up in the presentation, and I found it so interesting, the story that you told about, how he had asked his students to write an autobiography, and they come to find out that where they thought they were born wasn't their actual true birthplace. So have you found other stories like that as well, where because of the pain and shame that internees felt, they didn't share or divulge any information with their children?
It was very commonplace that families did not talk about what happened during camps. And you talk to a lot of senseis and who came up during that time, and they will tell you that when they heard their parents talking about camp, they thought they were talking about summer camp. They thought literally they were talking about some resort during the summer that they would go to. They had no idea that it was a concentration camp, that it was a place that was surrounded by barbed wire and military towers. Even Bob Matsui used to talk about, as a young child, he had no idea that this had really happened, and that he, as a grade schooler, was in class and his teacher said, Bob, tell us about the camps during World War II. She knew about them, right? And he said, those never happened. That just didn't happen, because in Bob's family at that time, they didn't talk about it. And as a result of that, there was a gap that started to develop. In 1978, the JCL passes its legislation, or its resolution, that says we want redress. And then early in 1979, they go and meet with the four legislators, with Matsunaga, Inoue, Mineta, and Maga reportedly says, komatane, big trouble, because they understood, the legislators understood how this would be perceived as a ethnic specific bill. This would be perceived as a special interest bill. And Senator Inoue even said at one point, he said, if we carry this bill, he had a very deep voice, and he was sitting right next to Bob Matsui. He puts his hand on Bob's shoulder. He says, this young man won't be here in 2 years. They understood how difficult it would be to get this type of legislation passed without some validation of the wrong that had been committed. And Senator Inoue suggested that there should be a commission hearing to study the problem and then to issue findings regarding what had happened. And that was a risky proposition, because what happens if they find against you? Or they say, yeah, the camps were a terrible thing, but they were justified because it was time of war. And the other reality was that in the late 70s, if we were to start a commission hearing, it might take 3 years or so for the commission to do its work, and then another year to write it up. It would be like 4 years before any findings came out. And in the late 70s, it was estimated that with every passing month, 200 elderly Issei were passing away. So for every month that we waited, justice delayed would be justice permanently denied. So it was a very tough decision. Do you go with this commission idea that the senator is putting forward? And yeah, his rationale was the American people don't remember what happened, and the American Congress don't remember what happened. And numerically, he was correct. There was only about 11 representatives and about 8 senators at that time who were still in office from World War II. So there wasn't an institutional memory of what happened to Japanese Americans. And ultimately, the decision was made, let's go forward with the commission hearing. And once that decision was made, the Japanese American community, it was the NCRR, the JACL, and other groups worked diligently to get people ready to testify. But imagine how threatening that is to your average Japanese American. Remember, these are the people who weren't even telling their children about the camps, right? And now they were going to go before a federal commission and share their innermost secrets, their stories that they hadn't told to anyone else. And in Los Angeles, Ron Wakabayashi, the JACL executive director, put together a mock commission hearing. And he brought in 15 of the JACL chapter presidents. They were all men at the time, but they were all used to doing public speaking. And he would have them stand before this mock hearing of 9 commissioners and tell their story. The first guy gets up, starts to tell a story, breaks down crying. He can't get through it. Second guy gets up, starts telling his story, breaks down crying, can't get through it. Not one of those 15 chapter presidents who was used to doing public speaking could tell their story, because for all of them, it was the first time that they were speaking publicly about this history. Another friend of mine, Richard Katsuda, was working up in San Jose, and he was working with the elderly. He convinced about 6 elderly Issei to make that journey to go to San Francisco. And the person who was driving the van said, on the way, you could hear a pin drop in that van. They were petrified about what they were about to do. They sat there in silence thinking about what it was that they were about to say to this federal commission. Well, they went to San Francisco. They testified in Japanese, and the translation was given to the commission. And on the way back, all you could hear was laughing and singing and them slapping each other on the back, because they had begun to face their demons. They had begun to tell the stories that they had kept bottled up for 40 years. You know. And I remember the hearings, because they came to Los Angeles, and I was a college student at that time, and I said, I'm skipping class, I need to be there. And to be there in a room, and many of them Nisei, you know, rough and tough, hard to bluff, they don't show emotion, and to hear testimony after testimony after testimony of people sharing their losses, sharing what they went through. And at the end of the day, there was not a dry eye in the audience. The testimony at the hearings reflected the pain and the agony of the community. And one testimony that reflected that was the testimony of a gentleman named Kiyoshi Sonoda. And Kiyoshi Sonoda was a dentist by training. When he was first sent to camp, he was put in charge of the infirmary. And Dr. Sonoda told the story of his first patient, a young, dehydrated infant. Dr. Sonoda said that under normal circumstances, he would be able to treat that baby and make him well. But because he didn't have the proper supplies, and because there was no proper equipment, all he could do was hold that infant in his hands and feel his last twitch before he died. And as he told that story, Dr. Sonoda had tears streaming down his face. And in the audience, his wife was sitting there, and she said, Kiyoshi is crying. Kiyoshi doesn't cry. Kiyoshi didn't even cry at his own father's funeral. And yet on that day, Dr. Sonoda did cry. And a room full of people cried with him. And I would contend that a community cried with him, as we, as the Japanese American community, found the courage and the strength to finally tell our stories and to demand an apology. And as powerful as those testimonies were, I would submit to you that the more powerful testimonies occurred in people's homes, around dining room tables, in living rooms, as a sansei would look at their parents and their grandparents and say, tell us what happened. Is this what happened to you? And their parents and their grandparents would sometimes for the first time share the stories that they had not shared for decades. And then they would ask their sansei children, can we really win this redress? Can we really get an apology? And the answer was, we don't know, but we have to try. And the divide that I had talked about earlier began to heal as our generations began to understand what really happened in World War II and the need for us not to forget. And so that was an unintended consequence of the commission hearings. Certainly it propelled the redress movement forward, but it healed us internally. The commission issued its findings in a document called Personal Justice Denied. And in that document, it said the camps were wrong, and that the camps were the result of war hysteria, race prejudice, and a failure of political leadership. Very powerful words to aim at one of the presidents who was so popular at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. From there, the redress legislative movement took off. The battle then went to Capitol Hill.
It's good to hear that on some level there was an understanding by the younger generation and vice versa of each other's viewpoints.
Right. Certainly the sansei can be credited with bringing energy and bringing questions, and and they were young and so forth. But there were some nisei, who were right there. And I remember I was engaged with a number of people talking about who's the MVP of redress. That's a question that can never be answered. It's like asking who is the greatest baseball player of all time. But one name that consistently surfaces was of a nisei, and that was Aiko Herzog Yoshinaga. And Aiko was not a legislator. Aiko was not an attorney. Aiko was not even a trained archivist. But she, with the help of her husband, Jack Herzog, would spend countless hours doing research in the Library of Congress, spending hours and hours going through documents. And she found incredible evidence that helped the commission hearing issue its findings. So again, the folks who made redress happen came from all generations, all genders, and all backgrounds. So let me ask you a question, Staci. I'm going to give you 4 names. I think you're going to be familiar with all 4 names. They were all on the House floor on September 17th, 1987. One of them did not vote in favor of redress. I want you to tell me who it was. Okay. Robert Matsui, Dick Cheney, former vice president, he was a representative at that time, very conservative Republican. Newt Gingrich, also another very conservative Republican, and Norm Mineta. One of them did not vote in favor of redress.
It seems like a trick question.
Well, of course.
Yeah. You wouldn't be asking it if it wasn't Robert Matsui or Norm Mineta.
Okay, so I will help you. You're right. Dick Cheney voted for redress, and that surprises a lot of people, but Dick Cheney comes from Wyoming, where Hart Mountain was. He understood the concentration camp story, right? Newt Gingrich, another very conservative Republican, right, understood that this was about the Constitution. So that leaves Bob Matsui and Norm Mineta. One of them did not vote in favor of redress.
I'm going to go with Bob Matsui.
And you would be wrong.
Norm Mineta.
Bob Matsui voted in favor of redress. Norm Mineta did not vote in favor of redress. But here's why. He voted present because he felt it would be a conflict of interest for him to vote for a bill that would bestow $20,000 upon him. A very principled reason for why he did not vote in favor of the bill. Of course he favored the bill. Of course he advocated for the bill. Of course he lobbied for the bill. And the truth be told, he knew at that moment the bill was going to pass. And so I did ask him once, I said, Norm, what would you have done? 435 votes in the House, 217 to 217, you're the last vote, what would you have done? And he just looked at me and said, I commit harakiri. But it's a great trivia question. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's very interesting. And now that you've explained the rationale behind it, it definitely makes sense and is so in line with Norm Mineta's character.
And there are also stories of great fortune, essentially where we got lucky that things fell into place so that the bill can move forward. So for example, in the 98th and 99th Congress, the bill on the House side could not get out of subcommittee because the chairs of the subcommittee just weren't excited about the bill. And it wasn't until the 100th Congress, through a series of happenstance, where the top 2 or 3 people who were going to be the chairs of that committee either get appointments elsewhere, become a judge someplace else, and so forth, that a young man by the name of Barney Frank becomes the chair of the subcommittee where the redress bill is held. Barney Frank was the only openly gay member of Congress at that time, and he understood discrimination. He understood oppression. And so when Matsui and Mineta found out that Barney Frank was going to be the chair, they got really excited and said, let's go see him. He saw them in the elevator one day, and he said, if you're coming to see me about your bill, don't worry about it. I'm passing it out of my committee.
Wow, that's a great story about Barney Frank. Do you have any other stories like that to share?
One story that I love to tell is that Norm Mineta was a 10-year-old Cub Scout when he was sent off to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And there was a camping outing with the local white American Boy Scouts. And so Norm gets paired up with this young boy named Alan. And they're pitching their tent that day. And Alan says to Norm, the kid next to us, I really don't like him. And when you pitch a tent, you have to cut a moat around your tent, and then you cut a cutout, so that's where the water will flow out. So Alan says to Norm, can we cut it so that the water flows into that kid's tent? And Norm, being the mischievous boy he was, says, sure, let's do that. And that night, it starts to pour. And somewhere around midnight, they hear the swoosh as the tent next to them gets washed away, and Alan and Norm are just laughing their heads off. And that Alan grew up to become Alan Simpson, a very conservative Republican senator from the state of Wyoming. And normally, somebody like Alan Simpson may have not supported the Civil Liberties Act, but because of his friendship with Norm, he understood, and he literally stayed out of the way so that the bill could pass the Senate. Again, you can't write a better script than that, but it actually happened.
So we've talked a bit about the veterans. Do you think that they were important in the passing of redress?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. There was a man named Grant Ujifusa who worked for the JACL as their legislative lead, and he coined the phrase, no vets, no redress. Because it was clear that based on what the Japanese American veterans of World War II did, you couldn't question the loyalty of the Japanese American community. Senator Inoue would say, all you had to do was refer to the veterans and kind of look at the legislator and say, and what did you do? It was an argument that almost made itself and spoke for itself. There's the story of a veteran by the name of Rudy Tokiwa. And there was a lobbying trip to Washington, D.C., and Rudy, along with 2 community activists, had an appointment to visit with a gentleman named Charles Bennett, a moderate Democrat from Florida. And Charles Bennett cuts them off and he says, you might as well leave. I'm not voting for any bill that makes my country apologize to anyone. Now, the thing about Rudy is that Rudy was wounded during World War II, and he walks on crutches. So he stays there for a second, and Charles Bennett looks at him and says, didn't you hear what I said? I'm not voting for your bill. Rudy says, I understand that, but I just wanted to thank you. And Charles Bennett says, thank me? I said I'm not voting for your bill. He says, that's not what I'm talking about. I want to thank you for your service to our nation as a congressperson, but also as a veteran who thinks of that damn bullet in your back every morning when you wake up the way I think about that damn bullet that's in my back. Rudy Tokiwa had done his homework. He knew that Charles Bennett was a wounded veteran. September 17th, the day it hits the House floor, both Representative Mineta and Representative Matsui go up to Charles Bennett during the arguments, and they say, hey, do you see who's up in the rafters? He looks up there in the rafters, in the handicapped section, with his army scarf on, with his canes as he's sitting there, staring at him, is Rudy Tokiwa. Now, I can't tell you what Charles Bennett thought in that moment, but I can tell you how Charles Bennett voted. He voted for redress. So that's a very tangible example of what the veterans did. But truly, their story, their patriotism, their sacrifice helped to convince people to vote for the bill, or at the very least silence the opposition to the bill.
Wow. Their service went beyond just what they contributed in the war.
Yes,
wow.
Very much so.
The Redress Bill and the Civil Liberties Act really passed as a result of a courageous Japanese American community and a lot of luck. You know, right place, right time. But you mentioned a quote by Justice Scalia, "In times of war, the law falls silent." This quote seems very relevant today. What is the takeaway from the redress movement?
I think there are several lessons. The first lesson that pops into my head is that we are blessed to live in a nation of law. We are blessed to live in a nation where we have, as individual citizens, the right to protest, the right to raise our voice and say, something is wrong and we need to change it and we need to address it. And in a nation of law, it's possible. But it's only possible if we remain vigilant, if we remain engaged, and if we remain active. And I think that's what Justice Scalia was talking about. The second thought is that justice is never secured. Maybe for the moment, but then as soon as that moment passes, we need to be vigilant to make sure that we stay engaged in keeping it alive and well. And I think the Japanese American redress experience reflects the strength of our nation, the strength of our citizenry, the strength of our people to be able to look at our history and to look at our values and say we need to continue to strive to live up to that.
So with everything we've talked about today, it's clearly evident that redress is very personal to you. So as the president of Go for Broke National Education Center, what does redress truly mean to you?
As president of Go for Broke, you know, we tell the story of our Japanese American veterans of World War II. And these men, who are now in their 90s, are my heroes. They did for our community, and they did for our nation a tremendous service of proving that being American isn't about the color of your skin or where your family comes from or what religion you are. It's a matter of the heart. And I know these guys, many of them came out of the camps to serve while their own families were behind barbed wire, denied the liberties that they were supposedly going to fight and possibly die for halfway around the world. Other of these soldiers came from Hawaii, where they were treated as second-class citizens working on the plantation. My uncle was in Company E. You know, they had all the reason to say no, and yet they chose to be an American. And for them in particular, I think redress is a validation of their courage, of their sacrifice, and of their vision that America can be a place where their family, their son's generation, and their grandchildren can have a place in America. Last summer, I was in the Vosges Mountains with my daughter. And there was a veteran there, and his name was Lawson Sakai. And here we were halfway across the world in the middle of this dense forest where one of the most famous battles, the Battle for the Lost Battalion, occurred. And Lawson was describing the terrain and the tall trees where the Nazis would aim artillery so that the trees would explode, and they were called tree bursts. And he explained how he was injured in that time, 75 years ago. So on one side was this hero, and on the other side was my Yonsei daughter, Lane, who's never had to question her place in America, who's never had to question her opportunities in America. And it was because of men like Lawson and his fellow soldiers. For them to receive redress, for them to know that their families received redress, is incredibly important to me. And when I speak to them, while they're very humble, I know that they're very proud. And as we all know, no vets, no redress.
Well, as much as you appreciate their courage and their sacrifice, I'm sure they equally appreciate the way that you're honoring their legacy and their story.
Thank you.
Powerful words about a powerful movement. Well, Mitch, I thank you so much for your time and your expertise, for sharing those with us today.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
And for those of you who'd like to tune in again, this interview and the presentation will be available on the Go for Broke National Education website, goforbroke.org. Thank you so much for being with us today.